The paper was folded in thirds. Solène had been holding it for 11 minutes. She knew because she'd watched the time on her phone change: 9:47, 9:48, 9:49, standing in the parking lot of the Emory Reproductive Health Centre while other women walked past her, some with small children on their hips, some with hope still visible on their faces. She didn't unfold it again. She didn't need to. She had already read every word. She knew exactly what it said and exactly what it meant and exactly how her life looked now compared to how it had looked 1 week ago. She put it in her bag. She walked to her car. She sat down and gripped the steering wheel with both hands and breathed. It had been a Tuesday morning. That was the part she kept returning to. On how random it had been. She had been making coffee. The kitchen smelled like cardamom because she always put cardamom in his coffee, a small habit she'd built without being asked, one of 100 quiet ways she had loved him. Darius was already at the table when she turned around, sitting very still. Hands folded, she knew before he spoke. She had always been good at reading rooms, he said. I need a woman who can give me children, Solène. This isn't working. Raised voice, no anger. She knew he had made that decision weeks ago. Maybe even months ago, since he started returning home late and making sneaky phone calls by 2 a.m. with hushed voice and giggles. She stood with the coffee in her hand and felt everything in her go completely still. She did not cry in front of him. She had learned, somewhere across 6 years of fertility clinics and hormone injections and failed cycles and bathroom floors in hospitals, that crying in front of Darius only made him uncomfortable. And she had spent so long making sure he was comfortable. She set the coffee down. She went to the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall. 48 hours later, she saw the photo: Darius, a restaurant. A woman named Imani Voss from his firm, younger, already rumoured to be expecting, in a red dress, laughing at something he said, his hand on the small of her back. His face open and relaxed in a way Solène hadn't seen in 2 years. She looked at it for 4 seconds. Then she closed the app. She opened her bank account. She paid the first month's rent on a 1-bedroom apartment across town. Then she opened every job listing site she could find and started applying. Anything, everything, it didn't matter. She just needed to move, needed to do something with her hands, needed to build a floor beneath her feet before she forgot what standing felt like. She applied for 14 jobs in one night. One listing stopped her. Live in household manager and child companion. Seo Estate, gated community, North Atlanta. Immediate start, discretion required. The salary was more than she had made in 2 years. The location was a mansion. It was almost certainly wrong for her. She clicked away, then clicked back. Then closed her laptop and made herself sleep. By morning she had sent the application. She was not looking for a miracle. She was looking for a way to breathe again. She didn't know those two things were about to become the same. You're just coming across my channel. Please subscribe and hit that like button, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because in just a few minutes, a 4-year-old girl is going to walk into a room, look at a complete stranger, and say something that will stop you completely cold. Episode 2. Before Solène arrived, the Seo Estate had 11 rooms and no sound. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the architecture, not the gate, not the immaculate landscaping, but the quiet. Seo Yiwon was 35 years old and had built a real estate development company that operated across 4 countries. He was methodical, precise. The kind of man who trusted systems over feelings because systems could be tested and corrected. He had applied that same discipline to grief, which meant he had created a schedule, maintained his work hours, hired the right professionals, and continued forward. It was not working. You could see it in Nari's hair. Every morning, Yiwon stood behind his 4-year-old daughter at the bathroom mirror and did his best. He had watched tutorials. He had bought the right products. He had learned the difference between a brush and a pick. But Nari's puffs came out uneven, one higher than the other, the left one slightly looser, and no matter how many times he tried, they never looked the way they had when Yuna did them. Nari never complained. She would look at herself in the mirror, then look at her father's face in the reflection, serious, concentrated, trying, and she would nod as if it was perfect. She was 4 years old and already protecting him. Nari Seo had not always been quiet. Yiwon had videos on his phone from before Nari at 2, narrating everything she saw in a running commentary that required no audience. Nari at 3, singing songs she made up on the spot with total confidence. Nari laughing so hard at her own joke that she couldn't finish it. Yuna had died on a Thursday in February 18 months ago. A car accident on a highway on her way home from her sister's house. She was 30 years old. She had texted Yiwon 20 minutes before it happened to say she was bringing him soup because he had a cold. After the funeral, Nari stopped narrating. Stopped singing. She still spoke when spoken to, still answered questions, still said please and thank you, still told her father when she was hungry or cold. But the constant, effortless stream of words simply stopped, as if something inside her had decided that the world didn't deserve all that sound anymore. The therapist said it was normal, said to give her time, said children process loss differently and that Nari was showing resilience in her own way. Yiwon nodded and thanked her and drove home and sat outside in his car for 25 minutes before he could make himself go inside. He had hired 11 candidates in 3 weeks. Nannies, household managers, former educators, a woman who had worked for 2 embassies. Every single one of them had been qualified. Every single one of them Nari had refused, not loudly, not with tantrums, but with the silent shake of her head and running to her room. She would sit across from them at the table in the sunlit room. She would look at them. And then she would get up, collect her rabbit and return to her room. The interviews always ended the same way. Yiwon had stopped believing anything would be different. Solène drove through the estate gates on a Wednesday morning in a car that needed new brake pads and a blazer she'd pressed the night before because she'd had nothing else to do at midnight. She had prepared. She had researched the estate, the name Seo Yiwon, the general expectations of a live-in household role. She had written notes. She had decided to be professional, calm, and appropriately formal. She had reminded herself that this was a job interview, not a lifeline, and that she was not desperate, she was strategic, she was a little desperate. The housekeeper, a quiet woman named Mrs. Choi, showed her to the sunlit sitting room and offered water. Solène sat down, placed her folder on her knee and reviewed her notes. The house was very quiet. She was led to the sunlit room where she took her seat and waited, then she heard it, small feet on marble. Solène looked up. The little girl stood in the doorway in a yellow dress, hair in 2 uneven puffs. She held a stuffed rabbit against her chest with both arms brown, well-worn, one ear nearly detached, hanging by a few threads of stitching. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She looked at Solène as if assessing her. Solène didn't move, didn't reach out, didn't soften her voice into the pitch adults use when they want children to like them. She just looked back and said quietly, "That rabbit looks like he's been through a lot." The little girl was still for 1 breath, 2, then she walked across the room. Episode 3. She climbed into the chair beside Solène, not across from her, not at a safe distance, but directly beside her, close enough that their arms touched. She sat with her feet dangling and looked straight ahead at the far wall. Solène did not speak again. She understood without knowing how she knew that speaking would be wrong, that this was not a moment for words, so they sat. The room was warm. Light moved across the marble floor as clouds shifted outside. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock ticked. Nari's breathing slowed. Her small shoulder dropped slightly against Solène's arm and then her head followed. Her eyes closed. Solène sat completely still and did not cry, though something behind her eyes burned as she imagined, just for a moment, what it would have been if she wasn't infertile. She didn't hear him come in. One moment the doorway was empty, and then Seo Yiwon was standing in it, still in his coat, a leather portfolio in one hand, and he had gone completely, utterly still. He was looking at his daughter, Nari, who had sat across from 11 strangers in this same room and refused every single one of them. Nari, who had not leaned against another person since the week after the funeral, when she'd fallen asleep on her aunt's shoulder, and woken up confused, and then pulled away and not done it again. Nari was pressed against this woman's side with her eyes closed and her shoulders down, and her face had the open, unguarded expression that Yiwon only saw when she was fully, deeply asleep in her own bed. He didn't move. Solène looked at him carefully. She expected to see discomfort, a father calculating how to professionally extract his child from an awkward situation. She expected him to clear his throat and redirect. He didn't. He just stood there with something moving across his face that he clearly didn't know was visible. Then Nari opened her eyes. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she turned her head and looked up at Solène. Then she looked across the room at her father directly without blinking and spoke. "Papa," she said, "this is my mama." The clock ticked. Yiwon's jaw shifted, a small, controlled movement. His eyes went from his daughter to Solène, who was sitting with her hands very still in her lap and the rabbit pressed between them. "Nari," he said, his voice was even, almost casual. He held Solène's gaze for 1 second longer than necessary, and then he crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite them and set his portfolio down and said, "I apologize for keeping you waiting." "I'm Yiwon," Solène said, "Solène Ibarra." Nari between them picked up the rabbit and held it against her chest and watched her father. The interview, such as it was, lasted 20 minutes. Yiwon asked 4 questions: her experience, her availability, her comfort with the live-in arrangement, and whether she had any concerns about working with a child who was still adjusting after a loss. His tone was professional, measured. He took no notes. Solène answered each one directly. She did not over-explain. She did not try to make him like her. At the end he said, "The role is yours if you want it. You can take a few days to decide." Nari, without looking up from the rabbit she was examining, said, "She wants it." Yiwon looked at his daughter, then at Solène. Solène thought about the apartment. She thought about everything she had lost, her life, her marriage, herself. She thought about the little girl who had walked into the room and comforted her in the way her husband of 6 years never could. She said, "I'll take it." She told herself it was practical, told herself it was the salary, the roof, the immediate start, told herself she was not making this decision because a 4-year-old's face had shown her something she recognized from the inside. She was not fully honest with herself, but she said yes. And somewhere in the house the silence shifted. Episode 4. Solène's room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a long hallway with a window that looked out over the back garden. It was larger than her entire apartment. She unpacked in 40 minutes and then sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house. She started work the next morning. Yiwon left the house at 6:52 every day. She knew because she heard the front door, then the car, then quiet. He returned between 7 and 8 in the evening, always with his phone to his ear or his eyes already moving toward the study. He said good morning to Nari and kissed her cheek. He said good evening to Solène politely. He never said anything in between. She understood quickly that the estate ran on his schedule, and that his schedule had no space in it for anything unplanned, not conversation, not interruption, not the ordinary mess of human closeness. He had built a very functional life and placed himself at the center of it alone where nothing could reach him. She recognized it because she had done the same thing, just in a smaller apartment. She didn't push. She didn't try to soften him or draw him out. She was there for Nari. She kept her focus there. Nari, it turned out, had been waiting a long time to be loud again. It didn't happen all at once. The first week she was still watchful, following Solène through the house with quiet, observant eyes, handing her things without being asked, appearing at her elbow at random moments just to stand there. Solène let her, never commented on it, never made it into something that needed explaining. By the second week, Nari was talking at breakfast, not to fill silence, to report. She had opinions about her serial, about the colour of the sky, about a dream she'd had involving a horse who could speak, but chose not to because he found most conversations boring. She delivered all of this in a serious, unhurried voice while Solène listened and asked exactly the right number of follow-up questions. By the end of the third week, there was laughter. Nari had invented a game where she taught Solène a song, and Solène had to sing it back wrong, slightly wrong, one word changed, one note off, so that Nari could catch the mistake and correct her with enormous satisfaction. Solène lost every round on purpose. Nari won every round with total sincerity and never once suspected. They played it every morning while Nari ate her toast. Yi-won came home one Thursday to the sound of his daughter's voice carrying from the kitchen, high, clear, laughing at something, and he stopped in the hallway with his keys still in his hand. He stood there for a moment. Then he moved to the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame. Nari was standing on her chair, deeply invested in correcting Solène's deliberately wrong version of a made-up song about a frog who wanted to be a chef. Solène sat with her chin in her hand, looking appropriately chastened, taking her corrections seriously. Nari had not noticed her father. Yi-won stayed in the doorway and watched until Nari finally caught him and shrieked his name and launched herself from the chair, and he caught her automatically. And over Nari's shoulder his eyes went briefly to Solène. She had already looked back at the table. He told himself what he felt was gratitude, relief that his daughter was healing. He told himself that was a complete explanation and moved on. He came home at 6:30 the following evening. He told himself that was coincidence. Solène noticed and she said nothing, and she was careful. She had trusted warmth before. She had built 6 years of her life inside it and been handed a folded piece of divorce paper on a Tuesday morning. She was not doing that again. She was not letting herself read into a man standing in a doorway, or arriving home 40 minutes earlier, or the way his voice changed, just slightly, when he said her name instead of a formal address. She redirected herself every time back to Nari. It was safer there. Nari's love was direct. It arrived without conditions and without history and without the possibility of being revised. The invitation from Nari's school came on a Friday, cream envelope, the school crest at the top. Annual talent competition. 3 weeks away, Solène read it to Nari at dinner. Nari immediately announced she would recite a poem and that she required an audience for practice starting that night. Yi-won across the table smiled, a real one, brief before he caught it, and said he would try to be there. Solène folded the invitation along its original crease. Try, she didn't say anything. She passed the invitation to Nari and asked which poem she'd chosen. Episode 5. Nari had chosen a poem about the ocean. Not because she'd ever seen the ocean, she hadn't, not yet, but because Solène had read it to her one evening and Nari had gone very still halfway through and said, "Read that part again." They had read it 6 more times that night. By the following morning, Nari had it memorized. They practiced every day for 3 weeks. In the kitchen after breakfast, in the garden before bath time, Once in the car on the way to school when Nari decided she needed to hear how her voice sounded in a moving vehicle. Solène sat across from her every single time and listened with her full attention. And when Nari stumbled on a line, she didn't correct her immediately, she waited, let Nari find her way back, and then nodded when she did. Nari's teachers sent a message 4 days before the competition. They wanted Solène to know that Nari had not spoken in front of a group since before her mother's death, that they were proud of her for entering, that whatever happened it was already a victory. Solène read the message, then set her phone down and went to find Nari. Nari was in her room rehearsing to the rabbit. Solène stood in the doorway and watched her, serious, focused, her small hands clasped in front of her the way Solène had shown her, and felt something she didn't have a word for. Pride. The feeling of watching someone choose to be brave when they have every reason not to be. The auditorium smelled like floor wax and expensive perfumes. Solène arrived with Nari 40 minutes early and sat with her backstage while other children ran past in costumes and parents hovered in the hallway with phones and anxiety. Nari sat straight and still with the poem running silently behind her lips. Solène took her hand. Nari squeezed back without looking up. Kept rehearsing. When her name was called, she walked out onto that stage with more confidence than she had shown in public in 2 years. She stood at the center, looked out at the audience and began. Her voice did not tremble. Not once. She delivered every line clean and clear and with the unhurried certainty of a child who understood exactly what she was saying. The auditorium went quiet. When she finished, she stood for one breath. Then she walked off the stage. The crowd cheered. Solène's voice was the loudest and Nari won. The boy's name was Caleb. He was 5 and he had performed a magic trick that had not quite worked and he was not gracious about losing. He found Nari near the refreshment table in the cluster of parents and children that formed after the awards. Solène was 2 steps away, pouring juice. She heard his voice before she understood what he was saying. You only won because the judges felt sorry for you. You don't even have a mama. Solène set the cup down. She heard it, every word, heard the silence around it, the parents nearby who shifted and looked away. Heard Nari go still. She crossed the room in 3 steps. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She stopped in front of Caleb and looked at his mother standing 2 feet away and she spoke directly to her. You will correct your child this instant. Because the next thing out of his mouth better be an apology, or you and I are going to have a very different conversation and it won't involve talking. I promise you don't want that. Mother blinked, her mouth open in shock. Solène glared at her, silently daring the woman to try her. The mother looked at her son. Caleb apologized now. The apology came fast and small and slightly tearful. Solène didn't watch it. She was already crouching down to Nari's level, turning so that her back was to the room and it was just the 2 of them. Nari's face was very controlled. Too controlled for a 4-year-old. The face of a child trying hard not to feel something in public. Solène put both hands on her shoulders and said quietly, fiercely, with every word meaning exactly what it said. She may not be mine by blood, but she is not alone. Not ever. Nari's control lasted about 2 more seconds. Then she wrapped both arms around Solène's neck and held on with the full strength of a small body that had been holding itself together for a very long time. Solène held her back, completely, without reservation. At the back of the auditorium, Seo stood with his coat still on. He had walked in 3 minutes ago, straight from a board meeting he had left early without fully explaining why, only knowing that he needed to be here, that try had never been the right word, that somewhere between the doorways and the breakfast table and the sound of his daughter laughing again, this had stopped being about Nari alone. He had arrived in time to see everything. He watched Solène cross the room without hesitating. Watched her stand in front of a grown woman without flinching. Watched her crouch down and speak to his daughter with the fierce, steady love of someone who had claimed her completely. Not because anyone asked, not because it was her job, but because she meant it. He watched Nari hold on. And every wall he had spent 18 months building carefully around himself simply gave way, quietly, completely, with no sound at all. He had spent 18 months believing that love was something you protected yourself from because losing it was unsurvivable. He had the evidence, he had lived through it, but he was watching a woman who had also lost everything, who had every reason to protect herself, choose actively in real time not to. He stayed at the back of the room until Nari spotted him. She came running. He caught her and held her and looked over her head at Solène, who was standing a few feet away, straightening, composing herself. Their eyes met. He didn't say anything. There was nothing adequate, but he didn't look away either. And neither did she. Episode 6. Something changed after the competition. Quietly, without either of them naming it, Yiwon came home earlier. Not dramatically, 20 minutes, then 40, then sometimes he was there before Nari's bath time, which he had almost never managed before. He started appearing in the kitchen in the evenings, not to interrupt, but just present. He'd pour himself water and lean against the counter and watch Nari show Solène something she'd drawn, asking 1 or 2 questions, staying longer than was necessary. Solène watched this and kept her distance anyway. She was not cold. She was not unkind. She laughed at the things that were funny and answered his questions directly and made sure Nari had what she needed. But she did not lean toward it. She understood in the careful, private part of herself that she'd rebuilt piece by piece over the last few months. That warmth from a man whose house you lived in and paid your salary was not the same thing as love. She had confused those two things before. She knew what that cost, so she stayed on her side. And she told herself it was enough. Darius showed up on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. She came back from dropping Nari at school to find him standing outside the estate gate in a grey suit, looking polished and rehearsed. He had clearly planned what his face would do when she saw him, open, regretful, the expression of a man who had arrived at a difficult realization and wanted credit for it. Solène stopped walking. Then she continued walking because she was not going to give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. Solène. His voice was soft, the way it had only been during the first few months of their marriage. I made a mistake. I've been trying to reach you for weeks. I miss you. Imani, she meant nothing. None of it meant what I let it mean. I need you to know that. She looked at him. She took him in, the suit, the prepared speech, the eyes that were watching her face for signs that it was working. She said, "You need to leave. I'm not asking to come back overnight. I just want to talk. Give me 20 minutes. We built 6 years together, Solène, that doesn't disappear. You made it disappear," she said. "On a Tuesday morning at our kitchen table. Now please go." She walked inside. She heard him call her name once more before the gate closed. He didn't stop. He came back 3 days later, then again the following week. He sent messages through numbers she didn't recognize when she blocked the others. He showed up at the school one afternoon, just in the parking lot, not approaching but there, visible so she would know he was there. And then the news reached her through a former colleague who still moved in those circles. Imani had lost the baby. And the baby had not been Darius's. Tests had confirmed it. The life he had chosen over her had collapsed, and the man who had sat at their kitchen table and told her calmly that she wasn't enough was now living with the consequence of what he'd actually chosen. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt tired, because his collapse didn't change what he'd done. It didn't give her back the years. It didn't unring the words he had said in that kitchen, the words that had lived inside her chest every time she stood in a fertility clinic, every time she apologized for her own body, every time she made herself smaller. He had chosen to destroy her. The fact that his alternative had also destroyed him did not make her whole. The pressure came from every direction at once. Darius showing up. A gossip account posting a photo of Solène entering the Seo Estate with a caption speculating about her relationship with Yiwon. enough to start conversations she hadn't asked for. A phone call from her mother asking questions Solène didn't have answers to. And underneath all of it, the thing she was least equipped to handle. Yi-won, coming home earlier every evening, standing in her peripheral vision with what looked like longing. She wanted none of it. She wanted very specifically to stop feeling everything she was feeling, for Nari, for this house, for the man who appeared in doorways and caught his daughter and had never once asked Solène to be anything other than what she was. She wanted it, and she did not trust it, and the two things together were unbearable. So she did the only thing that felt safe. She waited until Nari was at school and Yi-won was at work. She got her bag from the top of the closet. She folded her things carefully. She wrote a letter to Yi-won explaining that she was grateful, that Nari was extraordinary, that this had nothing to do with either of them and everything to do with her needing to stop before she couldn't. She set the letter on the kitchen counter. She picked up her bag, she walked into the hallway. And Nari was standing at the bottom of the stairs in her school uniform, eyes on the bag, face very still. School had ended an hour early. A half-day Solène had forgotten was scheduled. Nari looked at the bag. Then she looked at Solène. And she said nothing yet, but her eyes said everything, and Solène's chest seized completely. Episode 7. Nari did not move from the bottom of the stairs. She looked at the bag in Solène's hand. Then she looked at Solène's face. She was 4 years old and she missed nothing. Solène set the bag down slowly, not because she had decided to stay, because she could not walk past that face without stopping first. "Hey baby," she said, her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. "I thought you had school." "Came home early," Nari said. She looked at the bag again. "Where are you going?" Solène opened her mouth. She had the letter on the counter. She had the words prepared, she had thought this through, none of it came. "I was going to explain in A. Are you leaving?" Direct. No waver in it. The question of a child who has learned that adults sometimes talk around the truth because they think it's kinder, and who has decided she would rather have the truth. Solène crouched down to her level. "I thought it might be better if you leave," Nari said with complete quiet clarity. "I'm going with you." Solène looked at her. This small person in a school uniform with her hair in the uneven puffs her father made every morning, holding the rabbit against her chest, standing at the bottom of the stairs as though she had planted herself there and grown roots. "Nari, you said I'm not alone," Nari said. "You said not ever." The words landed exactly where Nari intended them to land. Solène had said that. In an auditorium, crouched on a floor with the full force of everything she meant. She had said it and she had meant it, and now a 4-year-old was handing it back to her and asking her to keep it. She didn't have an answer. She sat on the bottom step and put her face in her hands and breathed. She didn't hear the front door. She heard Nari say, "Papa," and looked up. Yi-won was standing in the hallway in his work clothes, keys in his hand. His eyes went from Nari to Solène to the bag on the floor. He took the scene in completely and went still. Nari walked to him and took his hand and looked up at him directly. She didn't explain. She just held his hand and looked at him, and Yi-won, who could read his daughter better than any document he had ever studied, understood immediately. He set his keys down on the hall table. He looked at Solène, still sitting on the bottom step, just sitting there with everything visible, the exhaustion, the fear, the grief she had been carrying since long before she walked through his front door. He crossed the hallway and sat on the step beside her. He was quiet for a moment. Yi-won was a man who chose words carefully, which sometimes meant people mistook his silence for coldness. It wasn't coldness. It was the effort of someone who did not want to say the wrong thing and understood that the wrong thing could not be taken back. "Not good at this," he said finally. "At any of this. I don't say the right things at the right time, and I work too much, and I lived inside my own grief for so long I forgot to come back out of it." Paused. "But I know what this house was before you. I know what Nari was. And I know what it's been since you came, and it's not nothing, Solène. It is not nothing." Looked at her directly. Don't go, not because of the job or the arrangement or any of that, just don't go, I don't want you to go. Nari, standing 2 feet away, nodded as though this was exactly what she would have said herself, given more time. Solène looked at the bag on the floor. She looked at Nari. She looked at this man sitting beside her on his own staircase, imperfect and honest and trying. She thought about the months she had spent with them and felt like family. She reached over and picked up the bag. She stood up, she walked it back to her room and put it on the top shelf of the closet. Then she came back to the hallway, looked at them both and said, "Nari, have you eaten?" Nari shook her head. "Go wash your hands." Nari went immediately and without argument, which was how she behaved when she had gotten exactly what she wanted and knew enough not to push it. Yiwon stood up. He looked at Solène with an expression she was finally ready to stop pretending she didn't understand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Darius is still out there." Yiwon nodded slowly. "Won't be," he said. "Not for long." Episode 8. Darius Whitfield stopped appearing within 2 weeks. Solène didn't ask exactly what Yiwon had done. She knew enough, a conversation, the right people involved, the kind of quiet professional consequence that leaves no visible mark but lands with complete accuracy. Yiwon had not threatened. He had not made a scene. He had simply made it clear, through channels Darius understood, that continuing to pursue Solène would cost him things he could not afford to lose. Darius was a man who responded to consequences. Always had been. The messages stopped. The parking lot appearances stopped. The calls from unknown numbers stopped. The silence that followed was different from every other silence Solène had known. It wasn't the silence of the one-bedroom apartment, or the silence of the clinic parking lot, or the silence of a kitchen where someone has just said the words that end a marriage. It was the silence of something that was finished. Genuinely, finally finished. She breathed differently after that. Even she noticed it. The house changed quietly, meals together most evenings. Not formal. Nari dictated the tone, which meant there was always a story being told or a song being debated or a question asked that nobody expected. Yiwon was different at that table than he was anywhere else. Less composed, more present. He laughed easily with Nari, and occasionally something Solène said caught him off guard and the laugh extended to include her, and neither of them made it into a moment. Sunday mornings became their own thing without anyone deciding they would. Yiwon made coffee. Solène made breakfast. Nari appeared in pajamas with the rabbit and took up her position on the couch and issued requests. Some Sundays they went out, the park, the market, once a long drive to nowhere in particular that Nari narrated from the back seat like a nature documentary. Some Sundays they stayed in, ordered takeouts, and the afternoon went slow and quiet in the way that only happens when people are genuinely comfortable with each other. Nari, on one of those slow Sundays, fell asleep between them on the couch with the rabbit on her chest and her feet in Solène's lap, and neither adult moved for 40 minutes so they wouldn't wake her. Yiwon looked at his daughter's face and then he looked at Solène and she looked back, and there was nothing to say that would have improved that moment. So neither of them said anything. The appointment had been Yiwon's idea, not pushed, suggested once carefully. He had a specialist he trusted. He said only that Solène deserved to have the full picture, whatever it was, and that if she wanted he would arrange it. Then he left it alone. She thought about it for 2 weeks. Then she said yes. The specialist was a woman in her 50s with a calm, unhurried manner that Solène appreciated. She ran the full panel. She reviewed Solène's history, all of it, the years of treatment, the failed cycles, the diagnoses that had accumulated like charges against her. She reviewed everything carefully. Then she looked at Solène across her desk and told her the truth. The problem had never been Solène. Her results were normal. Had always been normal as far as the records showed. The fertility failure across those 6 years had not been hers to carry. For the full picture to have been known, both partners needed to be tested, and Darius, the doctor noted with careful neutrality, had apparently never been tested at all. Solène sat in the chair across from this woman and heard every word clearly. She didn't cry. She didn't feel the satisfaction of being vindicated, because vindication was too small a word for something this large. She felt instead the full weight of what had been done to her, not by biology, not by fate, but by a man who had been too proud to consider that the problem might be his, who had instead handed her 6 years of failure as though it belonged to her, who had then handed her divorce papers on a Tuesday morning and walked away clean. He had never been tested. And she had spent 6 years apologizing for a diagnosis she was never given. She sat with that, then she stood up, thanked the doctor and walked to her car. She sat in the parking lot, a different clinic, a different life, and she put the 6 years down. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a resolution. She just decided quietly and completely that she was finished carrying it. She drove home. She told Yiwon that night after Nari was in bed. She sat across from him at the kitchen table and said it plainly, what the doctor had found, what it meant, what it said about all those years. He listened without interrupting, without filling the silences with reassurance or questions. He let her say all of it. When she finished, he reached across the table and took her hand. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." He didn't say, "I told you so," or "you deserved better," or any of the things people say when they want to respond but don't know how. He just held her hand, steadily, with his full attention. It was the simplest thing. It was more than anyone had given her in a very long time. She looked at their hands on the table and felt, for the first time in 6 years, that the weight was actually gone. Episode 9. The dress was the color of champagne, and it no longer zipped all the way. Solène stood in front of the mirror in their bedroom. Yes, hers and Yiwon's bedroom. The round of her belly, the fullness in her face. The woman looking back at her, who had survived things she hadn't been sure she would survive, and was standing in a champagne dress on a Saturday morning preparing to walk downstairs to a life she had not planned and could not have imagined. She had stopped being afraid of it. That was the thing she noticed most. Nari appeared in the doorway with a bow. It was pale gold, slightly crushed from being carried in a fist, and Nari had clearly selected it with great intention. She crossed the room without announcing herself, pulled a chair to the vanity without asking, climbed up and began pressing the bow into Solène's hair. "Still," Nari said. "I'm holding still." "Your head moved." Breathed. "Don't do that." Solène caught her own eyes in the mirror and pressed her lips together. Nari's tongue was at the corner of her mouth, which was what happened when she was concentrating on something that mattered. She was 6 now, had been 6 for 3 months, and she had opinions about everything. Clothing, food, the correct way to load a dishwasher, which side of the bed the rabbit should sleep on. She delivered all of these opinions with complete confidence and very little interest in being disagreed with. She had gotten that from somewhere. Solène suspected it was herself. The bow was placed. Nari stepped back on the chair and examined her work from several angles. She said, which was the highest praise she gave, then she climbed down from the chair, walked around to stand in front of Solène and placed both palms flat against the belly the way she had been doing since the day they told her. She pressed her cheek against it, closed her eyes. She said something soft. A murmur too low for Solène to catch the words, the careful mixture of English and Korean that Nari had built for herself over 2 years, a private language that belonged to her alone, assembled from the 2 worlds she moved between without effort. Solène waited. Nari stayed still for a moment longer. Then she straightened, looked up, and her face had the expression it got when she had done something she was very satisfied with. "What did you say?" Solène asked. "I told the baby," Nari said with complete calm, "that I already picked the best mama for us, so they're very lucky." Solène looked at her daughter. The word had arrived gradually, without ceremony, not on a legal document, not on a specific day, but in the accumulated weight of 2 years of mornings and songs and school runs and Saturday markets and hard days and ordinary ones. It had simply become true. She laughed. It started in her chest and came out bigger than she expected, the full laugh of a woman who had not laughed easily for a long time and now did it without thinking. Her eyes went wet, and she didn't stop the laugh to manage the tears. She let both happen at the same time, because she was no longer in the habit of managing herself out of feeling things. Nari watched her cry laugh with the expression of someone who had expected this response and found it appropriate. "Don't mess your face," she said practically. "We're going downstairs soon." The doorway Yiwon stood with his coffee and said nothing. He had come up to tell them breakfast was ready and had stopped when he heard Nari's voice, and then he had stayed because he couldn't make himself leave. He watched his daughter press her cheek to Solène's belly and whisper her private words. He watched his wife laugh until she cried. He watched Nari reach up and pat Solène's hand lovingly. They had tied the knot 1 year ago in a quiet ceremony. He smiled, thinking about everything that had led up to that moment. His daughter had known from the first minute what he had taken months to understand and almost lost by understanding too late. She had walked across a room and placed the thing she loved most into a stranger's hands, not because she was reckless, but because she was certain. Because at 4 years old, with all her loss and all her silence, she had still known how to recognize something real when it stood in front of her. He had needed longer. He was not proud of that, but he was here. They were here. This house that had once held only quiet now held all of this, the laughter coming from upstairs, the beau that Nari had selected with great seriousness, the baby coming in 11 weeks, the breakfast cooling on the table he no longer sat at alone. He had not built this. He had only been brave enough at the last possible moment to not walk away from it. Nari appeared at the top of the stairs. "Papa, breakfast." "Coming," he said. Solène appeared behind her, eyes still bright, bow slightly off-center from laughing. She met his eyes and shook her head at herself, and he smiled, the full one, the one that had come back slowly over 2 years and now arrived without effort. He pulled Solène into his arms and kissed her. Then they went downstairs. He listened to Nari explain to Solène the correct way to descend stairs when pregnant, which she had apparently researched. He thought, "My daughter knew first, she always had. Some people come into your life through pain and then they stay because they were always meant to." Nari didn't wait for permission to love Solène. She didn't wait to be sure or to be told it was allowed or to see if the adults around her would figure it out. She just knew. And she acted on what she knew, that is, the lesson. Not that love fixes everything, but that sometimes the bravest, clearest-eyed person in the room is the one everyone else is trying to protect. If this story stayed with you, give it a like and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. I want to ask you something real in the comments below. Was there someone in your life, maybe unexpected, maybe someone you almost walked away from, who turned out to be exactly what you needed? Tell me about them. I want to read every single one.